The servant girl was humiliated at auction. The prince clothed her and made her his wife. The church bell tolls. Dust rises in the square. A trembling girl is forced onto the block, mocked by nobles, stripped of dignity before the crowd's jeering eyes. Then, silence. A prince steps forward. His cloak falls across her shoulders, and in one breath, her fate is torn from shame to glory. But in the glittering palace halls, danger waits. The court whispers. A jealous countess sharpens her tongue, and the king himself declares their love forbidden. Just when hope flickers, a secret long buried rises from the shadows, a bloodline hidden, a truth that could change everything, will. Love strong enough to defy a kingdom survive the weight of scandal and pride? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of the town square as church bells tolled 6 times from the ducal palace's tower. The air was crisp with autumn's bite, carrying the mingled scents of fresh bread and wood smoke from the bakers' ovens. Merchants shuffled about, setting up their wooden stalls for the day's market, their voices joining the gentle clatter of cartwheels and the cooing of pigeons. Elizabeth stumbled forward as the guards propelled her toward the auction block, their iron grip on her arms brooking no resistance. Her empty stomach churned with dread, and her legs trembled beneath her thin dress. Since her father's death 3 weeks prior, she had eaten little more than scraps, saving what remained of their meager stores for the servant children who had depended on her father's kindness. The wooden platform loomed before her, its weathered boards stained dark from countless previous sales. Elizabeth's heart pounded against her ribs as the guards marched her up the 3 steps. The auctioneer, a portly man with ruddy cheeks and calculating eyes, gave her a cursory glance before turning to address the growing crowd. "Good morrow, good people of the duchy," his voice boomed across the square. "We gather to settle the debts of the late Master William through the lawful indenture of his daughter." The crowd pressed closer, nobles and merchants alike drawn by the prospect of acquiring a well-bred maid at a bargain price, their whispers carried to Elizabeth's ears like poison. "Did you hear? Her father gambled away everything." Living above their station, they were serve her right to learn her place. From the front of the crowd, Countess Amalia's laugh cut through the murmurs like a knife. She stood resplendent in a jade silk gown, her dark eyes glittering with malice as she surveyed Elizabeth's patched brown dress. My, the Countess drawled, tapping her fan against her palm. "What a sorry sight you make, little mouse. One can hardly believe your father once dined at the Duke's table." Her lips curved in a cruel smile. "Though I suppose even rats can climb high enough to fall spectacularly." Hot tears pricked at Elizabeth's eyes. But she blinked them back. She would not give the Countess the satisfaction of seeing her weep. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, letting her father's lessons in dignity armor her against the mockery. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Remove your cloak, girl. The buyers must see what they're bidding on." Elizabeth's fingers clutched at the worn wool that had been her mother's last gift to her. "Please," she whispered. "Might I not keep it?" "Remove it," he ordered sharply, "or it shall be removed for you." With trembling hands, Elizabeth undid the clasp. The cloak slipped from her shoulders, revealing the full extent of her reduced circumstances, the darned sleeves of her dress, the careful patches at the hem, the obvious signs of a garment altered many times to last as long as possible. The crowd's jeering grew louder. Someone called out a crude jest about beggars in fine stitching. Elizabeth's cheeks blazed with humiliation, but she forced herself to stand straight, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "True nobility comes from the heart, my dear, not the purse." "Let us begin at 20 gold pieces," the auctioneer. announced. "Who will open the bidding for this healthy young maid, well-trained in household duties?" A heavy-set merchant in a wine-stained doublet raised his hand. 20 gold pieces, he called out, his gaze traveling over Elizabeth in a way that made her skin crawl. The auctioneer nodded eagerly. 20 gold pieces bid? Do I hear 25? The merchant's smile grew wider as no competing bids emerged. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 20 gold pieces going once. Elizabeth's heart seemed to stop in her chest, going twice. The gavel began its descent through the morning air. Suddenly, a commanding voice rang out across the square. "Hold!" The crowd parted like water as Prince Alaric strode through their midst, his dark blue cloak billowing behind him. His presence drew every eye, and a hush fell over the square as absolute as if the air itself had been spelled to silence. The prince's boots struck the cobblestones with purposeful steps as he approached the auction block, his expression unreadable, but his eyes blazing with an intensity that made the auctioneer take an involuntary step backward. "Hold!" The prince's voice cut through the square like a blade through silk. "This auction will not proceed." Prince Alaric strode forward, his boots striking the cobblestones with purpose. The crowd parted before him like waves before a ship's prow, nobles and commoners alike bowing deeply. The morning light caught the silver threads in his deep blue doublet, but it was the stern compassion in his eyes that held Elizabeth's attention. The auctioneer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, clutched his ledger to his chest. "Your Highness, the law requires that debts be paid," Prince Alaric said, his voice carrying across the now silent square. "Nothing more." He turned to the steward at his side. "The total sum, if you please." The steward, a dignified man with silver at his temples, consulted a piece of parchment. 342 crowns, Your Highness." Without hesitation, Prince Alaric withdrew a leather purse from his belt. The soft clink of gold made the auctioneer's eyes widen. "Count it carefully," the prince commanded. "Every debt will be settled today." Elizabeth's legs trembled beneath her as the steward methodically counted out the coins. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, and she fought to keep her chin high. Despite the burning in her cheeks, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, could hear the rustle of silk gowns and the whispered conversations behind painted fans. "'Tis done, Your Highness," the steward announced, having verified the sum. Prince Alaric nodded once, then, in a gesture that sent fresh whispers rippling through the crowd, he unfastened his velvet cloak. The rich material, midnight blue and lined with silk, settled warm and heavy across Elizabeth's shoulders as he draped it around her. The familiar scent of beeswax and cedar wood enveloped her. "Her dignity," he announced, his voice ringing clear across the square, "is not for sale." Elizabeth's heart thundered in her chest. She had escaped the auction block, yes, but what new trap had she fallen into? A prince's attention could be more dangerous than a merchant's ownership. Her fingers clutched the edges of the cloak, its warmth both comfort and question. The crowd's reaction split like a stream around a stone. Some ladies sighed at the romantic gesture, whispering behind their fans about the prince's gallantry. Others, particularly the older nobles, muttered darkly about propriety and scandal. The wealthy merchant who had been about to bid slunk away, disappointment evident in his bearing. Prince Alaric turned to his steward. "See that Mistress Elizabeth is escorted to the palace seamstress quarters. Her skills with needle and thread are well known, and we have need of such talent." The steward bowed. "At once, Your Highness." As the prince turned to leave, his eyes met Elizabeth's for a brief moment. There was something in that glance, something that spoke of more than mere charity or duty, that made her breath catch. Then he was gone, striding through the dispersing crowd as people bowed in his wake. The steward's voice was gentle as he guided her away from the auction block. "Come, miss, The palace is much warmer than this square." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of stone corridors and introductions. The palace seamstress, a kindly woman with quick hands, showed Elizabeth to a small but clean room where she would sleep, and explained her duties for the coming days. When evening fell, Elizabeth found herself alone in the servants' hall, a bowl of savory broth and a chunk of fresh bread before her. Candles flickered in their iron holders, casting dancing shadows on the worn wooden tables. The cloak lay folded in her lap, its velvet soft beneath her work-roughened fingers. She traced the fine stitching along its edge, wondering at the strange turn her fate had taken. Why had a prince stepped forward to spare her? What had he seen in her that was worth saving? The broth grew cool as she sat lost in thought, the weight of the day's events settling around her like the heavy folds of the cloak itself. The morning sun streamed through tall windows into the palace seamstress chamber, where Elizabeth sat with needle and thread among a dozen other women. Her fingers, though weary, moved steadily through the fine silk she mended. The other seamstresses cast sideways glances her way, their whispers barely louder than the rustle of fabric. "Did you hear? The prince himself bought her contract." One murmured behind her hand. "Above her station, that one," another replied, lips pursed, "acting like she belongs here." Elizabeth kept her eyes on her work, letting their words wash over her like rain on glass. The prince's cloak lay carefully folded in her simple quarters, a reminder of yesterday's rescue she still struggled to understand. The chamber door opened, and Prince Alaric swept through on his morning rounds, a ledger tucked under his arm. The seamstresses dropped into curtsies, Elizabeth following suit, her cheeks warming as she felt his presence draw near. "Good morrow, ladies," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority she remembered from the square. As he passed, he paused, briefly by her workstation, offering a gentle nod. "I trust you are settling well, Miss Elizabeth?" "Yes, Your Highness." "Thank you," she answered softly, not daring to meet his eyes. The whispers around her grew to a steady hum as he continued on his way. The morning peace shattered as Countess Amalia burst through the doors, her silk skirts rustling like angry leaves. "I require immediate attention to my new ball gown," she announced, her sharp gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Elizabeth. A cruel smile curved her painted lips. "Well, if it isn't our auction block beauty," the Countess drawled, making her way to the fitting platform. "Come, girl. Let's see if those trembling hands can manage my hem without soiling it with common tears." Elizabeth rose slowly, gathering her tools with steady fingers. The other seamstresses watched, some with pity, others with poorly hidden satisfaction at her humiliation. She approached the Countess, who stood with arms spread while another seamstress helped her into the unfinished gown. "'Twas quite the spectacle yesterday," Countess Amalia continued, her voice carrying to every corner. "I've never seen someone so perfectly suited to the auction block, like a scared little mouse, weren't you? Though I suppose even mice can catch a prince's eye if they're pathetic enough." Elizabeth knelt to begin work on the hem, her needle moving in precise, elegant stitches. Under her breath, she whispered the prayer her mother had taught her long. "Egos, Lord, grant me strength in gentleness and victory in peace." "Your Highness!" The Countess's voice suddenly lifted in affected delight. "Come to ensure your investment is proving worthwhile." Elizabeth's fingers stilled as Prince Alaric's boots appeared at the edge of her vision. She hadn't heard him return. "Indeed, Countess," he replied, his tone cool and measured. "I was just admiring the exceptional needlework on display. Miss Elizabeth's embroidery shows remarkable skill. See how the golden thread catches the light? Such artistry speaks of natural talent and years of dedicated practice." The prince's words fell like gentle rain on parched earth, and Elizabeth felt her shoulders straighten slightly, though she kept her eyes modestly lowered. "How fascinating that you've developed such an eye for needlework, Your Highness," the Countess replied, her voice tight with displeasure. As evening approached, Elizabeth joined the other servants filing into the palace chapel for vespers. The sacred space glowed with hundreds of beeswax candles, their light catching the colored glass of towering windows. She took her place among the servants' rows, the familiar scent of incense wrapping around her like a comfort from childhood days. From her position, she could sense rather than see the noble families in their elevated pews. Yet even without looking, she knew Prince Alaric's gaze had found her among the kneeling servants. The weight of his attention felt like warmth on her bowed head, but she kept her eyes fixed on her clasped hands, not daring to lift them toward the noble section. The priest's voice rose in evening prayer, and Elizabeth let the Latin words wash over her, finding solace in their ancient rhythm. She remained still, a humble figure in her simple dress, as candle flames danced and shadows played across the chapel's stone floors. The palace gardens bloomed in the warm afternoon sun, roses nodding their heavy heads in the gentle breeze. Elizabeth sat on a stone bench beneath a flowering cherry tree, her skilled fingers working to mend the delicate lace of a court lady's shawl. The peaceful solitude was a welcome change from the cramped seamstress chamber. "Good day, Mistress Elizabeth." She, startled at the familiar voice, nearly pricking her finger. Prince Alaric stood before her, his presence both commanding and gentle. Elizabeth quickly rose to curtsy. "Your Highness, Please." He gestured to the bench. "Do not let me disturb your work. The gardens are meant for all to enjoy." His smile was warm as summer sunshine. Elizabeth settled back onto the bench, her heart fluttering as the prince chose to sit on a nearby stone ledge. The proper distance between them did little to calm her nerves. "I trust you have found your place among the palace staff?" he asked, his tone genuinely interested. "Yes, Your Highness. The work suits me well." Elizabeth's fingers resumed their careful mending, though she felt his eyes upon her hands. "Tell me," he said softly, "how came you to such circumstances? Your bearing speaks of better days." Elizabeth's hands stilled. The truth stuck in her throat, bitter as medicine, but she would not dishonor her father's memory with lies. "My father was a merchant, Your Highness. He believed too readily in others' promises. When the ventures failed, the debts mounted. He died of grief as much as fever, I think." Alaric's face softened with compassion. "Yet you speak of him with love." "He taught me that honest work and a true heart matter more than gold, Your Highness. I would rather mend lace with honor than wear silk in shame." A smile touched Alaric's lips. "Wisdom often hides in humble places," he murmured. Their peaceful moment was broken by a cry of distress. Near the kitchen gardens, a small boy, one of the stable hand's children, had collapsed beside a herb bed. Elizabeth was on her feet before she could think, the precious lace forgotten on the bench. She reached the child in moments, kneeling beside him in the dirt. His small face was flushed with fever, his breathing rapid. "Hush now, little one," she soothed, gathering him into her lap. Her cool hand pressed against his forehead, finding it burning hot. Prince Alaric appeared beside them, his own face etched with concern. "Shall I send for the physician?" Elizabeth shook her head. "A cool cloth and mint tea will serve better for now. The fever is not dangerous, just frightening for one so young." She began to sing softly, an old lullaby her own mother had once sung, while her fingers gently massaged the boy's temples. The prince himself fetched water from the nearby well, and a kitchen maid brought mint leaves. Elizabeth tended the child with quiet efficiency, her voice never ceasing its gentle song. Gradually, the boy's breathing steadied, and his eyes fluttered open. "There now," Elizabeth smiled, helping him sip the cooling tea. "Better already, aren't you?" As the stable-master came to collect his son with profuse thanks, the sun began its descent toward evening. Elizabeth rose, suddenly aware of the dirt staining her skirts and the time she had lost from her work. "Your Highness, I apologize." "For the interruption, no apology needed," Alaric said firmly. "Kindness is never wasted time." He gestured toward the palace. "Allow me to escort you back. The gardens can be difficult to navigate at dusk." They walked in companionable silence, maintaining a proper distance that somehow felt both necessary and regrettable. The prince's longer stride matched itself to her shorter steps, unhurried despite the growing shadows. At the entrance to the seamstress's wing, Elizabeth turned to curtsy. "Thank you, Your Highness." "The pleasure was mine," he replied softly. Their eyes met for a brief moment before propriety demanded they part ways. As Elizabeth watched him stride away, she pressed a hand to her heart, feeling something new and tender taking root there, like a seedling reaching for the sun. In the prince's careful kindness and genuine interest, she had glimpsed something she had never dared hope to find within the palace walls. Understanding. The morning sun streamed through the palace windows, but its warmth did little to chase away the chill of whispered conversations that followed Elizabeth through the corridors. Servants paused their work to watch her pass, their eyes following her movements with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The buzz of gossip filled every corner of the grand building, from the kitchens to the guard towers. "Did you see how the prince spoke with her in the gardens?" a scullery maid whispered to her companion as Elizabeth walked past. "3 times this week alone," came the reply, barely concealed behind a raised hand. Elizabeth kept her head high, though her cheeks burned. She focused on the steady rhythm of her footsteps against the polished floor, trying to ignore the way conversations died when she entered a room, only to spark again like wildfire the moment she left. In his private study, Prince Alaric stood. Before his father, the king's stern face illuminated by afternoon light streaming through tall windows. The room smelled of leather-bound books and ancient wood, the weight of tradition heavy in the air. "You forget yourself, my son," the king said, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the throne. "The negotiations with the foreign princess are delicate. We cannot risk offense when peace hangs in the balance." Alaric's jaw tightened. "I have made no improper advances, father. Simple kindness to those in our household." "Kindness?" The king's laugh was sharp. "The entire palace speaks of how you linger in the gardens, how your eyes follow the girl. You are a prince, Alaric. Your every gesture carries weight." "Then let it carry the weight of compassion," Alaric argued, though he knew his words would find no purchase in his father's practical mind. The king rose from his chair, his shadow falling across the rich carpet. "The foreign princess brings with her the promise of peace between our kingdoms. Would you trade that for a seamstress?" Alaric turned away, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have not forgotten my duty," he said, but his heart rebelled against every word. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth returned to her small chamber in the servants' wing. The room was modest but clean, with a narrow bed and a simple wooden chest for her few belongings. As she opened the door, a piece of parchment fluttered at her feet. Her heart quickened as she bent to retrieve it, unfolding the careful creases, to reveal a message written in an elegant hand. "Leave before you are cast out. Some heights are too dangerous to climb." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she read the words again. The paper was fine, the kind used by nobles for their correspondence, and a faint trace of expensive perfume clung to its fibers. She sank onto her bed, the warning settling like lead in her stomach. Night crept across the palace grounds, bringing with it the soft glow of candlelight and the whispered prayers of evening devotions. In her chamber, Elizabeth sat on the edge. Of her bed, The prince's cloak spread across her lap. Her fingers traced the fine velvet, remembering the moment he had draped it over her shoulders at the auction block. The gesture had saved her from humiliation, but now she wondered if it had marked the beginning of something far more dangerous. Gratitude warmed her heart as she remembered his kindness, his gentle words in the garden, the way he saw her as a person rather than a servant. But fear crept in like a shadow, dark and insistent. The warning note seemed to mock her from where it lay on her small table, its threats clear in the flickering candlelight. Outside her door, Countess Amalia stood. In the shadows of the corridor, a satisfied smile playing across her painted lips. Her silk skirts whispered against the stone floor as she lingered, imagining the fear her note must have sparked in the seamstress's heart. The candlelight from beneath Elizabeth's door cast just enough light to illuminate the Countess's triumphant expression. "Sleep well, little seamstress," Amalia murmured, her voice barely a breath in the darkness. "Dream of your prince while you can." With a rustle of expensive fabric, she turned and glided away, leaving behind only the fading scent of her perfume, the same perfume that clung to the threatening note. The summer evening wrapped the palace gardens in a gentle warmth as the sun began its slow descent. Elizabeth sat in the seamstress chamber, her fingers moving swiftly over delicate embroidery when a quiet knock interrupted her work. The steward stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Elizabeth," he said with measured courtesy, "His Highness requests your company for a turn about the herb gardens, if you are amenable." Elizabeth's heart fluttered as she set aside her work. Following proper protocol, she accepted with a small curtsy. "I would be honored, sir." The steward led her through the winding palace corridors and out into the evening air. Prince Alaric waited by the garden entrance, his tall figure silhouetted against the golden light. When he saw her, his face brightened with a warmth that made Elizabeth's breath catch. "Good evening, Elizabeth," he said softly, bowing with genuine respect. "I trust your day has been pleasant?" "Yes, Your Highness," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They began their walk, the steward maintaining a respectful distance behind them. The herb garden was a peaceful sanctuary, filled with the gentle scent of lavender and rosemary. Neat rows of sage and thyme lined the gravel paths, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. "I have observed you these past weeks," Alaric began, his voice low enough for privacy but still within proper bounds. "Your kindness to the sick child, your quiet dignity despite cruel whispers, your dedication to your work, they speak of a nobility that has nothing to do with birth." Elizabeth's cheeks flushed pink as she walked beside him, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Your Highness is too kind." "No," Alaric said with sudden intensity. "I am merely honest." He slowed his steps, turning slightly to face her. "I find myself thinking of you at odd moments. Your smile brightens my days more than any court entertainment." Elizabeth's heart thundered in her chest. She knew she should stay silent, should curtsy and withdraw, but the warmth in his eyes gave her courage. "My lord," she whispered, I dare not speak what is in my heart." "Please," he urged gently, "speak freely." She drew a trembling breath. "These past weeks have been like a dream. Your kindness, your protection, they have meant everything to me. But I am only a seamstress, and you—" She faltered, unable to continue. "And I am a prince?" Alaric finished softly. "Does rank matter more than the heart's truth?" "The world says it must," Elizabeth replied, her voice catching. "Then the world must change," Alaric declared with quiet conviction. As they rounded a corner of the garden, partially hidden by tall rosemary bushes, he reached for her hand. "I admire you, Elizabeth, more than admire. I will fight for the right to court you properly, no matter what obstacles we face." their fingers. Brushed together, the brief touch sending sparks through Elizabeth's entire body. It was the smallest of contacts, yet in the formal world of the court, it was shockingly intimate. The steward tactfully examined a nearby herb bed, allowing them this precious moment. "My heart is yours," Elizabeth whispered, hardly believing her own boldness. "But I fear what your world will do to stop us." "Let them try," Alaric replied, his voice fierce with protection. "I have never been more certain of anything than I am of you." The setting sun painted the garden in shades of gold and pink, casting a magical glow over their private moment. For Elizabeth, it felt as though the whole world had shrunk to just this garden, just this moment, just the warmth of his hand near hers. But their peaceful interlude could not last forever. As they made their way back toward the palace, reality intruded in the form of a familiar figure on the upper balcony. Countess Amalia stood watching them, her elegant form rigid with disapproval. Her eyes narrowed as she observed their closeness, the way they walked in perfect step with each other, the obvious affection in their bearing. The Countess's perfectly painted lips pressed into a thin line as she gripped the stone balustrade. Though too far to hear their words, the intimacy of their manner told her all she needed to know. She watched them until they disappeared into the palace, her mind already turning over possibilities for destroying this inappropriate attachment before it could bloom further. The great hall blazed with 100 candles, their light dancing, off golden platters and crystal goblets. Nobles in their finest silks and velvets filled the long tables, their jewels winking like stars in the warm glow. Elizabeth moved carefully between the tables, balancing a silver tray of sweetmeats with practiced grace. Her plain brown dress marked her as a servant, but she held her head high, remembering Prince Alaric's words about dignity. The feast honored visiting nobles from the northern provinces, and the palace had spared no expense. Peacocks strutted on silver platters, their feathers restored to fan behind succulent meat. Wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and brightening cheeks. Musicians played softly from the gallery above, their melodies weaving through the constant murmur of conversation. Elizabeth's heart quickened each time she passed near Prince Alaric's seat. He sat stiffly beside his father, barely touching his food, his eyes finding her whenever she drew near. She dared not meet his gaze directly, but his presence gave her strength as she navigated the crowded hall. Countess Amalia reclined in her chair like a cat about to pounce, her crimson gown a slash of blood against the white tablecloth. She had been watching Elizabeth all evening with cruel amusement, whispering behind her fan to those seated nearby. Now, as Elizabeth approached with her tray, the Countess's eyes gleamed with malicious intent. The Countess rose suddenly, her jeweled fingers wrapped around a golden goblet. She tapped it with a knife, the clear ring silencing the hall. "My dear friends," she called out, her voice carrying to every corner, "I simply must share the most fascinating tale about our little serving maid." Elizabeth froze, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. The king leaned forward, frowning, while Prince Alaric's face darkened with concern. "This so-called seamstress," Countess Amalia continued, pointing one elegant finger at Elizabeth, "was once auctioned like cattle in the town square. I witnessed it myself, a commendator's daughter up on the block for all to bid upon." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Quite a rise in station, would you not agree?" Gasps rippled through the assembly, followed by titters of laughter. Elizabeth's face burned crimson as every eye in the hall turned to stare. The tray shook more violently in her hands, the sweetmeats threatening to tumble onto the floor. Prince Alaric shot to his feet, his chair scraping back with a harsh sound. "You go too far, Countess!" His voice rang with authority and barely contained fury. "This woman has served with honor and skill. Her past circumstances reflect no shame upon her character." Silence. The king's command thundered through the Hall, stopping Alaric mid-sentence. The monarch rose slowly, his face dark with rage. "You forget yourself, my son. And you," he turned his stern gaze upon Elizabeth, "have caused enough disruption in my court?" Elizabeth's vision blurred with unshed tears. The tray finally slipped from her nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor. The sound echoed like a death knell in the sudden silence. "Remove yourself from my sight," the king ordered. "At dawn tomorrow you will leave this palace. Your presence here has clearly been a mistake." Elizabeth curtsied deeply, her movements mechanical, then fled the hall. Behind her, she heard the countess's triumphant laugh and the renewed buzz of gossip. She ran blindly through the corridors, past startled servants and guards, until she reached the small garden where she and Alaric had first truly spoken. There, in the growing darkness, she finally let her tears fall. The night air carried the scent of roses and the distant sounds of the continuing feast. She had known this dream could not last, but the pain of its ending cut deeper than she had imagined. Footsteps on the gravel path made her turn. Prince Alaric stood there, his face anguished in the fading light. "Elizabeth," he whispered, reaching for her hands. "Forgive me. I should have protected you better." "There is nothing to forgive, Your Highness," she replied softly, though her heart felt like it might shatter. "You showed me more kindness than I ever dreamed possible." "This is not the end," he vowed, his grip tightening on her fingers. "I will not let you go forever. Trust in that, if you can trust in nothing else." Elizabeth looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words burning there. Though she must leave at dawn, though her world had crumbled once again, something in her heart told her to believe him. Dawn crept over the palace walls, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose. Elizabeth stood beside a modest carriage, clutching a small leather satchel that held all she now possessed in the world. The morning air bit through her thin cloak, not the velvet one from Prince Alaric, which she had carefully returned to. "The steward's keeping the night before." "God be with you, miss," whispered one of the kitchen maids, pressing a wrapped loaf of bread into her hands. Elizabeth managed a thankful smile, though her heart felt as heavy as stone. The driver clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward, their hooves clattering against the cobblestones. Through the carriage window, she watched the palace grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the morning mist. Her fingers traced the rough fabric of her traveling dress, so different from the fine materials she had worked with in the palace seamstress chambers. The bread in her lap still held warmth from the ovens, a final kindness from those who had known her. After several hours of travel, the carriage brought her to her father's old village. How strange that just months ago she had left here in chains, bound for the auction block. Now she returned free but heartbroken. The driver helped her down, tipping his hat before continuing on his way. The village hadn't changed. The same crooked lanes, the same weathered buildings, the same church spire rising above the trees. Elizabeth made her way to the village square, where the laundress's cottage stood with its faded blue door. She had written ahead, arranging lodging with coins saved from her palace wages. The landlady, a stout woman with kind eyes, opened the door at Elizabeth's knock. "Welcome, child," she said, ushering Elizabeth inside. "The attic room is yours, and you can help with the washing to earn your keep." The attic room was small but clean, with a narrow bed beneath a window that looked out over the village rooftops. Elizabeth set down her satchel and smoothed the rough blanket on the bed. This would be home now. Days fell into a steady rhythm. Elizabeth rose before sunrise to help the landlady gather linens from wealthy households. They would spend hours at the riverbank, scrubbing clothes against washing stones until their hands were red and raw. The cold water numbed her fingers, but Elizabeth welcomed the distraction of honest work. Between washing days, she helped tend the landlady's small flock of chickens, scattering feed and gathering eggs. The simple tasks reminded her of helping in the palace kitchen gardens, though she tried not to dwell on those memories. Each Sunday, Elizabeth attended services at the village church. She sat quietly in the servant pews, head bowed in prayer. The villagers whispered behind their hands. They remembered her as the merchant's daughter, now returned in disgrace. Some faces showed pity, others scorn, but a few nodded respectfully at her composed demeanor. "That's the one who caught a prince's eye," she overheard one woman murmur to another after services. "But see how she carries herself still, no airs or bitter complaints." "Aye," replied her companion, "there's dignity in honest work, and she's not too proud to do it." In her attic room each night, Elizabeth lit a single candle and knelt beside her bed. The flame's glow reminded her of countless palace candles, of stolen glances across the great hall, of walks in the herb garden at dusk. But those dreams belonged to another life now. "Dear Lord," she whispered, clasping her hands tightly, "grant me the strength to accept what cannot be. Help me find peace in this simple life, even if—" Her voice caught, and she had to pause before continuing. "Even if I never see him again." A tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto her folded hands. Outside her window, stars wheeled silently overhead. The same stars that shone above the palace where a prince might be standing at his window, thinking of a seamstress who had touched his heart. Elizabeth wiped her eyes and climbed into bed, pulling the rough blanket close. Tomorrow would bring more washing, more whispers, more moments of loneliness to endure. But she would face them all with the quiet grace that had first caught Alaric's attention, even if he would never see it again. The morning sun warmed the cobblestones of the village square as Elizabeth wrung out linens at the communal washing well. Her hands, red from the cold water, worked steadily despite her weariness. Around her, the usual morning bustle of village life filled the air, the baker's cart rattling past, children chasing chickens, women gossiping as they drew water. A commotion at the village entrance drew everyone's attention. A royal messenger, his blue and gold livery dusty from hard riding, galloped into the square. The horse's hooves clattered against the stones as he pulled to a stop, causing the villagers to gather in curious clusters. "I seek the maiden Elizabeth," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "By order of Prince Alaric!" Elizabeth's heart leaped into her throat. She straightened slowly, aware of all eyes turning toward her. The whispers began immediately, spreading like ripples in a pond. "Did he say Prince Alaric? The prince himself seeks our washerwoman. There must be some mistake." The messenger dismounted and approached her, bowing slightly. "My lady, Prince Alaric bids me tell you he follows close behind. He has searched 3 villages before finding word of you here." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she dried them on her apron. "The prince is coming here?" Before the messenger could answer, another sound rose. Hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. The crowd parted as Prince Alaric himself rode into the square, his fine clothes travel-worn, his face showing signs of exhaustion and relief. Without waiting for his horse to fully stop, he swung down from the saddle. The villagers gasped as the prince, heir to ancient nobility, strode purposefully toward Elizabeth. More shocking still, he dropped to one knee before her in the village square, taking her work-roughened hand in his. "Elizabeth," he declared, his voice carrying clearly to all gathered, "I have searched for days to find you. I will wed no other. You have shown me that true nobility lies in the heart, not in titles." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The village priest, Father Thomas, pushed forward through the onlookers. His aged face bore an expression of profound recognition. "Your Highness," the priest called out, his voice quavering with emotion, "before you speak further, there is something you must know, something I have carried in silence these many years." All eyes turned to the elderly priest as he approached, his steps slow but determined. I knew Elizabeth's father well. He was more than the failed merchant people believed him to be. In my church records, I hold proof of his true birthright. He was a cousin to the royal line, cheated of his inheritance through treachery in his youth. Elizabeth's breath caught. Father Thomas, what are you saying? The priest pulled a weathered document from his robes. Your father chose to live quietly rather than fight his enemies at court. But his noble blood, and yours, my child, is documented here. Though your line was diminished, you are indeed of noble birth. Alaric rose, still holding Elizabeth's hand. Then there can be no further objection to our union. Elizabeth, will you return with me to court? Will you help me prove to all that love and nobility of spirit are worth fighting for? Tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes as she gazed up at him. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, I will. The villagers erupted in cheers. Women wiped tears from their eyes, men threw their caps in the air, and children danced in circles around the couple. The landlady who had taken Elizabeth rushed forward with a shawl to wrap around her shoulders. Alaric lifted Elizabeth's hand to his lips, his eyes shining with joy and determination. Yet both knew their path would not be easy. They still had to face the king's judgment at court. But now, armed with truth and their love for each other, they had hope. The prince's horse was brought forward, and he helped Elizabeth mount behind him. The villagers gathered close, offering blessings and small tokens for luck. Father Thomas carefully folded the precious document and handed it to Elizabeth. God go with you both. The priest blessed them, making the sign of the cross. May truth and love light your way home. As they prepared to depart for the palace, Elizabeth's heart pounded with equal measures of joy and apprehension. The king's reaction to these revelations remained unknown, but at least now she and Alaric faced the challenge together. The great hall fell silent as Prince Alaric approached the king's throne, Elizabeth at his side. Father Thomas's ancient document lay open on the marble floor before the king, who studied it with intense concentration. The morning sun streamed through stained glass, casting rainbow patterns across the scene. Father, Alaric spoke clearly, his voice echoing, I ask your blessing. Elizabeth has proven her worth not through birth alone, but through dignity, grace, and the love of those she serves. From the gathered crowd, servants stepped forward one by one, speaking of Elizabeth's kindness. The kitchen maid she had nursed through fever, the stable boy she had taught to read, the gardener whose family she had fed from her own meager portions. The king's stern expression softened as he listened. His eyes moved from the document to Elizabeth, who stood with quiet grace, her head bowed respectfully. At last, he rose. Love that inspires such loyalty cannot be denied, he declared. Let it be known that I grant my blessing and approve a special marriage license this day. Within hours, the palace chapel bloomed with white lilies. Nobles and servants alike filled the pews, a sight unprecedented in the kingdom's history. Elizabeth entered wearing a gown of ivory silk, every stitch sewn by her own hands, adorned with delicate embroidery that told their story in threads of silver and gold. Alaric's eyes shone with tears as he took her hands before the altar. I vow to love you for all my days, he promised, his voice thick with emotion. You have taught me that true nobility dwells in the heart. Their kiss sealed the union as bells pealed joyously across the kingdom. That evening, Elizabeth walked the palace corridors not as a servant, but as princess. In their chambers, she paused before a display where Alaric's velvet cloak, once offered in mercy, hung beside her wedding gown. What had begun as a gesture of pity now stood as a testament to love's power to transform the humblest beginning into the most glorious triumph. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.